And joining us now on the debate, Glenn Murray, Minister of Research and Innovation and the MPP for Toronto Centre. Jim Wilson, Progressive Conservative MPP for Simcoe Grey. And Jim Coyle, Queen's Park columnist with the Toronto Star. And for the record, we invited a member of the NDP caucus to join us tonight, but sadly no one took us up on the offer. Anyway, tonight is a Your Agenda broadcast where you are part of the discussion. You can send us an email with your views at theagenda@tvo.org. You can reach us on Twitter at twitter.com, #YourAgenda, or on our Facebook page at facebook.com/theagenda. Our fifth column blogger, Mike Miner, is hosting a live chat on our Inside Agenda blog. He's at tvo.org/theagenda and on the Facebook page as well. So please jump in and we'll get your comments up on the screen throughout the course of tonight's broadcast. Gentlemen, good to have you all here back at TVO. Nice to see you again. Let's roll this out. Minister, you get to go first. $30 million to attract international PhD students to the province of Ontario and our universities. How come?
Pretty critically important. I think that probably have to start with a very basic fact. When I was born in 1957, 2/3 of people in Canada made things for a living. We had an industrial economy. It was very constrained. People worked for a company their whole life. Most of our wealth was generated by production. Today it's very different. Almost increasingly, and the majority of our wealth is generated by innovation. People are highly mobile. Human talent drives job creation and business startups. We have an extraordinary talent pool that we've invested a huge amount of money in Ontario. We built an extraordinary university system. It is a portal to new economic job creation.
Okay, so, I'm waiting for a and therefore.
And therefore.
This is my biggest challenge tonight, is going to be to keep him on a clock and save time for you guys. All right. But I've known this for years. So anyway, we're going to try again.
Filibustering. There you go. So there's 40 scholarships. It's $20 million from the government, $10 million to be raised by universities to bring 75 elite scholars from China, leaders in their field, that will come here. Each of them will probably generate about $38,000 in new revenue. Our foreign students generate about $1 billion a year in GDP growth in the Ontario economy.
75 scholarships originally, trending to 300 at some point.
It'd be like recruiting Ovechkin for the Maple Leafs. It's putting alongside Ontario's best, attracting the very best innovators in ICT, the person who will help us develop the next generation of this.
That's all well and good, except Ovechkin at the Olympics plays for Russia. And I think that's something of what Mr. Wilson's side feels is missing in all of this. What's your objection to all this?
Well, I mean, it's kind of a slap in the face to Ontario students. We have many of the best and brightest here. They're from every ethnic background you could name in the world. And their families are struggling right now to pay their taxes, to pay their bills, and to send their kids to school. I met last week with a group of random students from U of T. In the room were 4 students that had 3.8 grade point averages that could not afford and weren't getting any government assistance to go to grad school. So they couldn't afford to go on and do a master's or a doctorate. And they were pretty darn mad.
Wait, if they couldn't afford it, wouldn't there be government programs to help them go if they're qualified students?
Not for every student. There's a lot of money. I agree with the minister here and with Minister Malloy that they do spend a lot of money on scholarships, but not every student gets it. There's thousands of students that have to fend for themselves, and their families are struggling right now. So, we're not against international students. We have thousands in our system now. They come because of the quality of education, and they pay their own way. And when the Premier announced that we're going to welcome more international students in his last budget this year, he said we were going to do it like a business, like Australia, and get into the business of welcoming students. They would pay 2 to 3 to 4 times more than domestic students, and then the next announcement comes 3 weeks ago saying, they're going to cost $30 million of Ontario taxpayers' money and students' money, and I just think the timing's horrible. We do have the best and brightest, and we should be developing our homegrown talent with that kind of money.
Jim Coyle, what do you say on this?
Well, I probably have as much reason as anyone to worry about tuition costs. I have 3 kids at university right now, but I tend to think the program is fabulous, and for the very reason that students my son's age think it's fabulous. And these are young people who've grown up in a global economy. They're not the way we were in our day. Even when premiers of the past came to Queen's Park, they often hadn't traveled widely, if at all. Several times, in many cases they hadn't been off the continent, as recently as I think Mike Harris probably, at the time he got elected. I'm not sure Dalton McGuinty had been off the continent until he became premier. We tended to think the world ended at Detroit, the Quebec border, and maybe Sudbury. Even the far north was a mystery to us. But the thing that changes a lot of premiers, I think, is travel. When Mike Harris went abroad, he came back with the megacity idea once he saw that no one had heard of Ontario abroad, but they all knew Toronto. And he knew that the modern world was driven by large urban conurbations.
No, so we get it. The international flavor you think is important, but what about Jim's point that it's $30 million of Ontario taxpayers' money?
Well, I can see how a lot of people are annoyed at it, say, if they're under stress of tuition, but this is not what this is about. This is a sort of a long-term economic investment, you know, building relationships with those countries, having different groups here. You know, we had a good story by Louise Brown in the Star this week about a 26-year-old Chinese researcher here on a scholarship who was working on cancer research, you know, and he said, you know, I'm spending every cent I get, I'm spending here in Ontario, it's not leaving the province, and think of the lives that might be saved by some of this high-end research.
Could you speak to the taxation, because it was true that the government initially said, yeah, we want to attract as many foreign students as possible, and we'll charge them more than we charge homegrown students, and we'll actually turn this into a profit-making center for us. And now suddenly we find out it's going to cost $30 million. So why is this good?
Well, it's not going to cost $30 million. Let's just go back to your last point.
Okay.
Yeah, in hockey, you're right. Ovechkin does go play for Russia. 80% of the students we bring here to Ontario on foreign students, period, not on scholarships, most of them pay to come here, stay. 80%, almost all of them create new jobs. $1 billion more to the GDP. So we're talking 40 scholarships a year for a 4-year period of time for 75 of the most elite intellectuals, leading computer scientists, engineers, healthcare people. Who's asking us to do this? Business leaders? I'm out in Kitchener-Waterloo, Communitech, which is the RIMS, the OpenTechs. These people think this is desperately important. They say any political party that doesn't understand the value of a $40,000 scholarship, having access to that person. On top of that, I have Mike Lazaridis sitting down with me. I'm working with Neil Turok at the Perimeter Institute. We're trying to bring the 5 leading scholars in quantum mechanics here so that we can be the first place in the world that invents the quantum computer and other quantum technologies, because that's hundreds of thousands of jobs.
Okay, let me put the math to Jim Wilson.
But the Israelis are doing this, the Australians are doing this, and we are doing it with less money and more effect and more outcome than anyone else is right now.
Jim Wilson, 80% stay, and it's $1 million per student generated for our economy for what Glenn Murray says is a modest investment.
Well, no doubt it does. But, you know, earlier this year, the government cut they campaigned in 2007 and did implement for a year or two the textbook and technology grant, which is $300 for every college student and every university student. And in March of this year, I asked the minister in the House why he cut that to $150 and only to selective students. He said, because we don't have the money. And we're struggling. And he went on about how much we're putting into OSAP and how much more we need to do. And then to suddenly turn around 6 months later, find $30 million for foreign students is a real kick in the teeth. And I think it shows that Dalton McGuinty's out of touch with the average family. I don't think he realizes how many bright people we have here who aren't going to have the opportunity to go to grad school. These young people that I'm out consulting with now, and we'll do much more in the next few weeks. Many of them already have $26,000 is the average for undergraduate students to have in debt, and they simply have to go to work. Their families have said to them, no, you're bright, we love you, but we can't afford to send you off to grad school. And I think everybody wants international students. We have thousands here. The minister often compares this taxpayers. I mean, this is the first time in Canadian history that the taxpayers have come up for a full scholarship, and students themselves through the university's money that they'll kick in. It's normally Rhodes scholarships and that come from foundations. They come from the private sector. So this is the first time the government has gone out, found $30 million to look good in Hong Kong, I think, is what the trip was about. And frankly, it's a betrayal to our young people.
We call this Your Agenda Thursday because we want to get feedback from the viewers as the program is on the air live. So have we got one, Michael, that we can put on there right now? Here it comes. Okay, this one via our website. If we foster excellence in our own institutions, then they will come. Starving our universities, but then throwing money into international scholarships for students from Asia seems almost retrograde. Glenn Murray, you want to comment on that?
Well, let's look at scale here. I'm going to come back again. 75, not 1,000, not hundreds, 75 of the best.
It's 300.
Of the best.
300.
Second of all, we putting in that same period of time $2 billion into student aid for Ontario students. That's hardly abandoning them. And this is supported by every single major student association in Ontario, including doctoral students. And then it's a bit rich, if I can be quite frank, Steve, to hear from the Conservatives, who raised tuition rates 67% and cut from our universities $485 million. You want to talk about abandoning students? No government in record than the government that my friend Jim was a minister in more abandoned students, left them with higher tuition fees, and the largest disinvestment in post-secondary education from the party of Bill Davis that built our education system.
Do you want to be a bit of a referee on this one before I hear from Jim Wilson?
Yeah, I'll try. There's no doubt it's politically risky for the very reason that Jim cites. It's very easy to generate resentment and anger about it. But it's also courageous and consistent for the Premier in the same sense that I think he was hugely transformed by the recession. He's been hugely affected by his trips abroad. You go to India and China nowadays, and you realize that Ontario is very, very small, and we better be very, very good at some things. But the recession has, I think, convinced him that we needed to change, we needed to become excellent, we needed to be ready for the post-recession economy, and that's why he's got, I think, the harmonized sales tax, green energy, and these sort of things. This is a long-term investment for excellence down the road and making Ontario universities better known abroad. You know, the Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all these places go after foreign students, and they're an easy sell because everyone around the world knows the name. And this is a way to advertise and promote Ontario universities abroad.
That may be a long-range plan. Politics tends to be a short-range business, though. I don't have to tell you.
That's the tight wire he's walking, isn't it? Whether people, whether the anger will surmount the fact that by most appraisals of academics, business people, this has got a tremendous upside.
Let me ask you, Jim Wilson, about the optics on this. Is the Conservative Party's problem with this more to do with optics than the substance of it? Because you've argued that McGuinty, the Premier, looks out of touch in your view. Yeah. Is this actually good policy, but you think maybe the timing is wrong or the optics of it are bad?
Well, I think we do a lot for international students now, and there are thousands in the system. They come because of some of the programs we do have out there. In your own ministry, I had a number of students that would come because of research grants, and they'd be attracted to research teams. We have some of the best and brightest. It's just that he is out of touch. The Premier doesn't seem to realize that families are struggling in Ontario. His admission...
gave him a hydro rebate
Yeah,
today.
gave him a hydro rebate. He's finally coming around to what we're saying. And the student groups, they're starting to change because I think they're realizing their constituencies, which are resident Ontario students. Let's see what the CFS said today. Students have called on the McGuinty government to make real investments to improve access to post-secondary education by reducing tuition fees and student debt. In addition, students are hoping the newly announced Trillium scholarships for international graduate students will be distributed equally among all students studying in all disciplines on the basis of demonstrated financial needs.
So not just for international students.
Yeah. Now, they did come out very strongly in the first day in favor of what the government announced, but I think they're hearing what I'm hearing and what my party's hearing, and that is families are very frustrated.
Optics?
Well, as again, 67% increase in tuition out of the Tories and a 41%, $485 million cut.
Okay, I hear you. But we're here now. We're here today.
No,
now.
but just in the context of that, what was the damage that did? It created negative images of our college and university system over. It put a lot of students who are some of Ontario's brightest and best, and we've been having to rebuild that. On top of rebuilding that, I think, successfully, each of those 75 people create jobs. Let me give you one example. I'll take it to another province. When I was mayor of Winnipeg, we attracted Naranjan Dalla, leading cardiovascular researcher. Within a handful of years, we had 360 leading cardiovascular researchers here. One of our first international students, Dr. Young Kang, became the Dean of Medicine at at Western, is now one of the leading HIV researchers and has created more jobs, Steve, than I and my family have in a few generations.
Been on this program.
So what Jim is arguing is more costs for Ontario families, taking billions of dollars of future GDP away, taking every time one of those students decides not to come here. And why those 75 elites? Because what we know in Chinese culture and the Chinese government, they look to see where the best and brightest are going. And we're not the only country doing this. And if the best people in the class come and incented, the Michael Lazaridis, the Tom Jenkins, the Tom Hudsons, want these particular researchers here because they will create jobs for other Ontario families. The same way we have to compete because our best in Ontario are being invited by other governments, Israel, Australia, the United States, France. They're trying to take our 75 best and we're trying to keep them.
Okay,
but
equal
you need
time
both.
over here. Equal time. Go ahead. You want to respond to
Well,
that?
it's 300 students and $30 million in a year when your own government said we can't afford to give the textbook grant that we promised and that students really appreciated to our own students, that we've had to cut it in half. So I don't jive. He goes over to Hong Kong, China, and suddenly has $30 million for international students. It just doesn't sit well. And the students are coming. The international students are coming in droves because of the quality of the education that we offer and some of the world-class teams we have here. But to ignore our own students and our own hardworking families is just really hard to swallow.
The president of the University of Waterloo, you like Waterloo, you talk about Waterloo a lot. Absolutely. He did an op-ed piece in Jim Coyle's paper just last week, and I want to read an excerpt of that. Share it with you and our viewers. The benefits are immediate and obvious, he wrote. It's been noted that international students directly contribute $1 billion annually to Canada's economy. That substantial economic contribution is just one aspect of their value to this country and province. Their presence in our universities broadens the education and enriches the cultural understanding of Canadian-born young people. International graduate students bolster the brainpower of existing research enterprises. The Trillium scholarships are sending a message to the world that Ontario is serious, that we are committed to achieving this global ambition. The importance of that message is worth far more than what will be spent on these scholarships. The investment is well worth it. Jim Wilson, do you worry that when you hear people who are in the system, who know the system well, say things like this, that the Conservative Party looks a little narrow-minded on this issue?
Well, I think some people are trying to paint it that way, but I respect that the presidents of universities, they want a cash infusion whatever way they can get it. This is a first in Canada where taxpayers are on the hook for $30 million for foreign students. I think the Premier could have used his influence among many of the businesses that Mr. Murray's talking about to raise $30 million. And that's what they do in the United States and every other country when they're attracting students. They raise them, they set up the foundations, and they do it that way. They don't take money and textbook money and tuition money. You know, we have the highest tuitions in Canada right now, and we support our students to the lowest amount of any government in all of Canada on a per capita basis. So had we had you know, better support, I suppose, and there was $30 million lying around, great. But right now we have our own students struggling. I mean, you just have to sit in a room, you should have them on your show, of young people that simply have too much debt now, and their families and themselves, they can't afford to go to the next stage of education, and they are as bright as any international student you're going to find out there.
Let me ask the other Jim. Do you think the Tories look narrow-minded on this?
I'm afraid I do, and part of it's based on the record of Mr. Hudak for the last year. He hasn't seen a wedge issue he doesn't like and leap on like a dog on a piece of meat. You know, this is a key lead up to the campaign. Yeah, it's a real sense of someone huddled inward of the Ontario, maybe of 40 or 50 years ago when we were a little complacent and when the world ended at our borders. And as far as timing is sort of the excuse, it's the last refuge of weasels in a way. You know, basically you're conceding that the ideas are good. The timing is the political weasel word. And in many respects, the timing is perfect because Canada's done a lot better than many of the other countries elsewhere in the world through the recession, to come out of the recession. And maybe we're in a good chance to get some money in there and get more of those students.
Okay, but if you were, let's take Mr. Wilson's example. If you were one of those kids who had good marks and you wanted to go on to a post-grad education somewhere, you couldn't afford it, you weren't eligible for whatever student assistance program grants or bursaries might be out there, you might be pretty ticked off to hear about this program, wouldn't you?
You might be if that were the case, but I'd like to meet a lot of them because I think we're not filling, Canadians aren't, Ontarians aren't filling a lot of those available spaces, and I suspect there's a lot of support, scholarship money. A lot of scholarship money goes unclaimed through years for students in that situation. Part of the reason is we're not getting enough homegrown talent in those PhD programs. And the rest of it, where the real disgruntlement often comes in, is people saying, I'm having a hard time meeting a tuition for a BA, or I've been laid off and lost my job, I can't get into second careers. But this is an entirely different animal we're talking about in you know, the attraction of these elite students.
In your last answer, I'm not sure you ever did address the issue of optics, which, and by that I mean, you stand by the policy, you think it's good policy, you think it's the right thing to do for Ontario, but we're 11 months until the next election campaign, and Mr. Coyle is right when he says, you know, Tim Hudak has been very successfully jumping on wedge issues, and this can be a wedge issue that he might jump on.
But you know,
so does this look bad for you to be offering this money to foreign students at this time?
Could it be more clear-cut? I haven't met a CEO of a major company, and I sat with about 30 of them, of our leading companies this morning over breakfast. This topic came up. It was unanimous. I had two Conservative friends of mine said they were...
What was unanimous?
Unanimous that we should put out what they reviewed as a rather modest investment compared to the amount of money they spend on academic recruitment and talent recruitment.
So why don't they pay for it?
Well, they do, and that's their point. I mean, you look at the amount
But
of
they're
money.
not paying for this
But
program.
you look at the money at University of Waterloo that you mentioned that comes out of that community in scholarships. It's in the millions. We're working right now, there's proposals right now for multi-million-dollar chairs and scholarships. Our private sector is doing its job, but there is a critical role for government to step up and do this. And